The chill in the air on October 27, 1989, signaled a change no one could predict. Amy Mihaljevic, a bright-eyed 10-year-old from Bay Village, Ohio, was heading to school that day, unaware that it would be the last time she would walk those streets. Bay Village, once a peaceful town where doors were left unlocked and children played freely, would soon be shaken to its core. Amy was familiar with her daily routine walking to school, studying, spending time with friends, but that afternoon, an unexpected phone call altered everything. A man, claiming to be a coworker of Amy's mother, Margaret, told Amy that her mother had received a promotion at work. To celebrate, he planned to take Amy shopping for a special gift. The voice was warm and reassuring. It knew about her mother's job and weekend plans. There was no reason for Amy to feel uneasy. To her, it seemed like an innocent adventure, a brief escape from the mundane. She agreed to go with the stranger, unknowingly stepping into a trap. Excited, Amy left her friends behind, saying goodbye as she walked out the door. In her school uniform, she thought only of the shopping trip she had been promised. Little did she know, her decision that afternoon would alter the course of her life and her family's forever. Amy's destination was the Bay Square Shopping Center, a short walk from school. The weather was crisp, the leaves scattered across the streets. It was an ordinary afternoon to anyone watching. But for the town of Bay Village, it was the calm before the storm. At the shopping center, witnesses reported seeing Amy talking to a man near the parking lot. The man appeared harmless, perhaps in his early 30s, blending in with the crowd. He didn't seem out of place. Amy seemed at ease. The exchange appeared normal, a quick conversation, a friendly wave, and then Amy walked away with him. That was the last time anyone saw Amy alive. By evening, the alarm was raised. Amy was missing. Her parents, frantic, called the police. The entire community sprang into action. Friends, neighbors, and law enforcement searched the area, hoping to find Amy safe. But the shopping center offered no answers. No one had seen her leave with anyone. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. Amy's mother, Margaret, felt a deep sense of dread. Something was terribly wrong. By nightfall, the town's atmosphere had shifted from peaceful to fearful. The search continued, but no signs of Amy emerged. As the hours passed, the urgency grew. Amy's parents were beside themselves, consumed by worrying. Their daughter was gone, and the search was yielding no results. The silence was suffocating. Despite the growing panic, the search turned up nothing. There were no clues, no signs, and no witnesses who could provide any useful information. The only detail that emerged was the description of the man who had last been seen with Amy. A few blurry recollections, but no concrete evidence to lead the investigation forward. For the community, the fear began to grow. A small town that had once been a haven of peace was now a place of suspicion and anxiety. For Amy's parents, the nightmare was just beginning. As the search for Amy continued, the community grew more anxious by the hour. Bay Village, once known for its tranquility, was now gripped by fear and uncertainty. The police scoured every corner of the town, retracing Amy's steps, questioning anyone who might have seen something, anything that could help them locate the young girl. Despite their efforts, the hours turned into days, and the search turned up no significant leads. Amy's mother, Margaret, could barely function. Her heart raced with every phone call, every knock on the door. Could this be the call that would bring her daughter home? Could someone finally bring her the answers she desperately needed? Her husband, Mark, though devastated, began to channel his grief into something else: anger. He could not fathom the idea of someone taking his daughter and leaving her family in agony. He wanted answers, wanted justice, and was ready to do anything to find out who had taken Amy. Meanwhile, the FBI had been called in. The case was no longer just a missing child case, it was now a full-scale investigation into a possible abduction. Federal agents joined the search efforts, bringing in more resources, more manpower. Still, despite their best efforts, Amy's whereabouts remained a mystery. The townspeople, too, were growing restless. They had all known Amy. She was just a child, a girl who belonged to the community. The idea that someone could take her from them was unfathomable. The thought that a predator might be hiding in their midst was terrifying. But what could they do? No one had seen anything unusual. No one had any answers. And then, just as the community was beginning to lose hope, there came a break. A jogger, running along a rural road some distance from the town, had stumbled upon something that would forever change the investigation. The jogger's heart skipped a beat as he came across a child's body lying in a field. It was far from Bay Village, more than 50 miles away. In a secluded area where no one would expect to find such a grim discovery, the body was identified quickly. It was Amy Mihaljevic. The news hit the town like a ton of bricks. The hopes of her safe return were dashed, and the nightmare of knowing that Amy had been murdered was now a terrible reality. The fear that had plagued Bay Village for days had now turned into horror. The search for Amy had ended, but it was not the outcome anyone had hoped for. The discovery of Amy's body sparked an even greater urgency in the investigation. Now, it was not just about finding a missing child, it was about finding her killer. The police, the FBI, and forensic teams descended on the field, combing through the area for clues. Every inch of the scene was examined, but once again, the investigation hit a wall. No clear leads emerged. The killer had left very little behind. It was as though Amy's abduction and murder had been carefully planned and executed with chilling precision. As the days passed and the search for clues continued, Amy's parents were left to grapple with the devastating reality. Their daughter, whom they had once hoped to find safe and sound, was now gone forever. The only thing left was the question of who had taken her life and why. For Amy's parents, the pain of loss was overwhelming. Every day, they fought against the crushing weight of grief, hoping for some kind of breakthrough in the case. But as the investigation stalled, they had to face the painful truth. The person who had killed their daughter was still out there, living among them. The investigation continued, but with each passing day, the answers seemed further and further out of reach. As the investigation into Amy's murder progressed, the town of Bay Village was no longer the quiet, peaceful place it had once been. Fear and suspicion ran rampant. Everyone seemed to be looking over their shoulders, wondering if the killer might be someone they knew. The police, while still determined, were growing frustrated. They had no witnesses, no leads, and no idea who might have had the motive to commit such a heinous crime. The FBI's resources were stretched thin as they followed every possible lead, but they were always met with dead ends. The case began to take a toll on Amy's family. Margaret, already shattered by the loss of her daughter, began to retreat further into herself. The grief was unbearable, and the frustration of not knowing who was responsible for Amy's death made the pain even worse. She struggled with the unrelenting question, who would do this to my child? Mark, too, was consumed by anger. The unanswered questions gnawed at him. Who was this monster, and why had they taken his daughter? He couldn't rest, couldn't focus on anything else. His heart was heavy with grief, but it was also filled with a burning desire for justice. He knew he had to keep pushing forward, even when it seemed like every step led to another dead end. For weeks, the investigation went nowhere. The police re-interviewed friends, family, and witnesses. They revisited the shopping center, hoping for some forgotten detail, some clue that might break the case wide open, but there was nothing new. Amy's killer had covered their tracks too well. Then, in 1990, a glimmer of hope appeared. A man named Dean Runkle, whose physical appearance resembled the composite sketch of the man last seen with Amy, was brought in for questioning. He had a criminal history, and the police wondered if he might be the one who had taken Amy. Runkle was adamant that he had nothing to do with Amy's disappearance. His alibi checked out, and after extensive questioning, the police had to let him go. Runkle, though an interesting suspect, was not the killer. Yet, the possibility that someone close to Bay Village might be involved hung heavily over the investigation. The sense of fear in the community grew. As the months passed, the investigation continued with no new leads. The media coverage waned, and people began to move on with their lives. But for Amy's family, the pain of not knowing who had taken their daughter's life never faded. It was an ache that never left them. Then, in 2018, another breakthrough came. A man named Robert Ivan Nichols was connected to the case. Nichols had been living under the alias of Joseph Newton Chandler III, and his criminal past raised alarms. He had been involved in other unsolved crimes, and investigators began to wonder if he could be the key to unlocking the mystery of Amy's murder. But despite a thorough investigation, Nichols was never definitively linked to the crime. His connections to other unsolved cases only raised more questions. The hope of finally finding closure began to fade once again. For Amy's parents, the years dragged on in a haze of grief and uncertainty. They could only cling to the hope that, one day, someone would bring them the answers they so desperately needed. But as the investigation continued to stall, it felt as though the truth might never be uncovered. In the years that followed, the investigation into Amy's murder seemed to hit more dead ends than breakthroughs, despite advancements in forensic technology and countless efforts by the FBI. The case remained unsolved. New suspects came and went, but none could be definitively linked to the crime. As the years passed, the hope of finding the truth began to fade, but the pain never truly left. Amy's parents, Mark and Margaret, were left to navigate their grief with no answers. Every year that passed without resolution felt like another layer of agony. They still clung to the hope that one day, the person responsible for their daughter's death would be brought to justice, but with each passing day, it seemed less likely. The community, too, had moved on. Life in Bay Village slowly returned to its familiar rhythms, but the memory of Amy's disappearance and death lingered. Then, in 2024, something remarkable happened. Forensic advancements, particularly in DNA analysis, allowed investigators to revisit evidence that had long since been collected. A small but significant trace of DNA was found on Amy's clothing DNA that had never been fully analyzed before. It was a breakthrough that reinvigorated the investigation. The DNA sample was sent to a lab for further testing, and investigators began to cross-reference it with national databases, hoping for a match. The hope of finally identifying Amy's killer after all these years was rekindled. But even as the new investigation began to unfold, Mark and Margaret remained cautious. They had been down this road before, and the pain of false hope had scarred them deeply. The investigation team worked tirelessly, but there was still no guarantee that the DNA would lead to a breakthrough. It was a waiting game now, one that had dragged on for decades. And yet, even as the clock ticked forward, the Mihaljevic family refused to give up hope. They knew that finding the truth, no matter how long it took, would be the only way they could truly begin to heal. Then, in a twist that no one had expected, the DNA sample led investigators to a name. David Winters, a man who had been living under the radar for years, was linked to the DNA found on Amy's clothing. Winters, whose criminal history included violent offenses, had been in the area around the time of Amy's disappearance. His name had never been seriously considered as a suspect until now. The authorities immediately turned their attention to Winters, bringing him in for questioning. The evidence against him began to mount. The DNA match, combined with other circumstantial evidence, painted a chilling picture. It seemed that the long search for answers was finally drawing to a close. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that there were still more questions than answers. Despite the mounting evidence, there was no physical proof that Winters had killed Amy, no eyewitness testimony, no solid alibi, and no clear motive. As the investigation continued, the feeling of uncertainty grew. Could this man, who had been living in the shadows for so long, truly be the one who had taken Amy's life? Or was there another suspect waiting to be uncovered? For Mark and Margaret, the possibility of justice finally being within reach was both a relief and a torment. They had been waiting for this moment for so long, but they also knew that the truth might be even harder to bear than the uncertainty. Still, they pushed forward, unwilling to let the case slip into obscurity once again. The investigation was far from over, but the new evidence had reignited a fire that had long since dimmed. The truth was finally within reach. The question now was whether it would be enough to bring Amy's killer to justice. As the investigation into Amy's murder continued to unfold, new developments kept the hope for justice alive, but the journey was far from over. With David Winters now under scrutiny, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together his movements, his connections, and any potential links to the crime. Winters' criminal history made him an intriguing suspect, but the lack of concrete evidence kept the investigation in limbo. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, the police still lacked the smoking gun that would connect Winters directly to Amy's murder. There was no physical proof, no DNA at the crime scene, no eyewitnesses, and no clear motive for why he would commit such a brutal act. The frustration of running in circles while the truth remained elusive weighed heavily on the investigation team. For Amy's parents, the emotional toll was becoming unbearable. Every new lead, every small piece of evidence that emerged seemed to stir up the pain of the past. They had already endured so much grief, so much uncertainty, that each new development only added to their anguish. The possibility of closure loomed large, but it was also a constant reminder of the years spent searching for answers. Mark, driven by the desire for justice, refused to let go. He attended every meeting, spoke to investigators, and followed every lead, no matter how small. For him, the fight for justice was the only way to keep Amy's memory alive. But with each passing year, the frustration grew. The fear that the killer might never be caught, that Amy's death might remain an unsolved mystery, was a constant shadow over his life. Margaret, on the other hand, struggled to cope with the emotional strain. The years of searching, the constant reminders of her daughter's murder, had taken their toll. The grief that had once been sharp and raw had become a dull ache, always present, but never truly healing. Margaret had retreated into herself, unable to bear the weight of the pain any longer. Despite their differing ways of coping, both Mark and Margaret remained committed to finding the truth. They refused to let Amy's memory fade into obscurity. The investigation, though frustrating and painful, was their only hope of getting the answers they had so longed for. Then, in 2025, another twist in the case occurred. Winters was arrested. The breakthrough had come when new forensic evidence linked him to the crime scene, an unexpected match that finally tied him to Amy's murder. The evidence was not definitive, but it was enough to bring Winters in for questioning. As investigators pieced together the final pieces of the puzzle, the chilling truth began to emerge. Winters had been living under an alias, hiding in plain sight for years. His history of violent behavior, combined with the DNA evidence, pointed to him as the prime suspect. The pieces of the case, long scattered and disconnected, finally came together. For Mark and Margaret, the arrest was both a moment of relief and a moment of reckoning. They had waited for this day for years, but the knowledge that Amy's killer was finally being brought to justice did not bring the peace they had hoped for. The pain of losing their daughter, the years of waiting for answers, still haunted them. But at least they now knew who was responsible. The killer, who had evaded justice for so long, would finally face the consequences of their actions. The investigation was far from over, but with Winters now in custody, the journey toward justice had taken a significant step forward. Mark and Margaret could finally begin the long road toward healing, knowing that their daughter's memory would not be forgotten. After years of searching for answers, after the pain of not knowing who had taken their daughter's life, the moment of truth was finally within reach. But even as the trial began, the emotions for Amy's parents remained complex. For Mark and Margaret, this was not a moment of closure, but a difficult and painful step toward it. They had waited so long to find out who was responsible for their daughter's death, but now that they had the answer, they had to confront the reality of it. Their worst fears had come true. David Winters, the man who had taken their daughter's life, was finally facing justice. But for Amy's parents, it wasn't enough to simply know who had killed her. The anguish of the years lost to uncertainty and the cruel, violent way in which she had been taken still tore at them. Throughout the trial, Mark sat through every day of testimony, his mind flooded with memories of his daughter. Every word about the brutality of Amy's death was like a knife to his heart. He had lived through the unimaginable, and now, sitting in that courtroom, he was forced to relive it all over again. Yet he refused to look away. He needed to know the details. He needed to see that justice was served, no matter how painful it was. Margaret, on the other hand, struggled to attend the trial. The emotional toll had been too much for her to bear. She had withdrawn from the public eye, retreating into the shadows of her grief. She had spent years hoping for this moment, but now that it was here, the reality of it overwhelmed her. David Winters was found guilty of the abduction and murder of Amy Mihaljevic. The moment the verdict was read, Mark felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The long fight for justice had finally paid off, but the victory was bittersweet. Amy was still gone,